Hi, this is David Gornoski, host of A Neighbor's Choice and Things Hidden podcast, as well as some of our other programs like Science and You with our chief science advisor, Dr. Yu, and our seed oil survival series that we continue to have great fun unpacking the truth of nutrition. I wanted to give you a quick little message saying we appreciate all the support that we get from our uh, monthly contributors and our one-time donation supporters. And we'd encourage all of you to go to our website, a neighborschoice.com, click on contribute, and make a monthly pledge today, whether it's $1, $5, 15, 20, 50, whatever you want to do. Doesn't matter. Just be a part of building this new media project that we've developed to empower and inform, to inspire, to kickstart a scientific renaissance, an anthropological breakthrough and reformation in the church. All these things are possible with your support right now. So make that commitment today and help us keep doing the productions that we have. Thank you. So glad to have you back for another Things Hidden podcast. I'm your host, David Gornoski, and it's been great to see the continual case that we have made on this program continue to unfold in current events in a way that is just dramatic and powerful and undeniable. The case that we've made for the anthropological revelation and impact of the biblical story of the personhood revolution of Jesus, encountering history, upending expectations, haunting nations that are saturated with the gospel text, and then turning societies upside down in terms of how their societies are going to function. What are the stories that are going to capture the hearts and minds of the people of societies that have long had the biblical text in its bones, in its fabric of thought and culture. So that's what we're going to do on this discussion in light of the recent indictments of Donald Trump. This is how many criminal indictments now? It's like 100 at this point. Who knows the full total indictment insanity these people are going through, but they're playing right into the trap of what God has set up for kings and empires and nations that want to preserve their glory through violence. Their means of creating order, societies, nations, in ancient society, and even now today, they're still trying to do the same rabbit trick, is sacrificial violence, trying to take on a kind of cleansing effect by piling up accusations after accusations, onto a singular target. Sometimes it can be an identity group, sometimes it can be, but it's most effective when it's a personality, most effective when it's an individual. And that scapegoating mechanism was the glue that held societies together in ancient civilizations. I've talked about this a lot through the years. But when Jesus comes into history, the gospel unveils that, exposes it for the fraud that it is, that might makes right is not going to be the new founding order mechanism for Jesus's global project of renewal of creation and mankind. And that those who would continue to use attempts to expunge or expel or purge or kill or sacrifice one for the greater good, as Caiaphas wanted to do with Jesus, anybody who does that, it's going to continually, perpetually become harder and harder to keep doing that magic trick without it creating more schism and more blowback and more boomerang effect, so to speak, onto those who are using sacrifice and might make right imposition to maintain their grip on power in the hearts and minds of men. And so this is a media war. Mythology is media. And mythology was always predicated on the idea of being able to justify a little bit of violence for the greater good, to stave off chaotic violence. But in light of 2,000 years of the gospel saturation, that God desires mercy, not sacrifice, that God will make the rain fall on the just and the unjust, that God wants us to forgive rather than to condemn and accuse. When God says, wait a second, this is how you guys create religion, by human sacrifice, I'll walk into that role of being the human sacrificial victim, and I'll show you what's truly sacred, which is the individual, which is the human person, which is the family that makes up the human person, which is forgiveness and love and grace and self-emptying agape love. That's where holiness will now be found, not in purity versus impure. Donald Trump and the nationalist, populist type, or just anti-establishment community in America that he has become an avatar for, is completely impure. Those folks are completely impure in the holy temples of D.C. Okay, D.C. had riots with the Summer of Love riots where they were at the gates of the White House, so much so that they had to put the president in the bunker. And they laugh at that moment to this day. They don't mention that as a moment where D.C.'s sacred democracy and institutions were threatened, because the person occupying the White House represented an impure heretic according to the official religion of D.C., and those on the outside were righteously indignant in trying to expose and to shake the cage of this impure heretic. And that's how the media recorded it. That's how the institutions and bureaucracies, and there's no grand juries for those folks. They're not having any sentencing. There's nothing going on. Just like when he won on his inauguration, there was hundreds of people that were arrested for violence and burning things up in the streets. None of them served any time. They all basically got off scot-free because they were rioting in the name of the official religion of our nation. And that religion is a kind of violent, false form of standing up for the underdog, of victim concern, that justifies wars in perpetuity, that justifies crooked globalism, that justifies nihilism forced down into the minds of little children. All of that is the project of those who want to maintain their power. Their power is based on a might makes right that's hidden under the veil of ever more emotionally charged victim narratives. And so they feed off of that. But the problem is they can't help themselves because they're not as wise as they pretend. They're not as wise as even their opponents think they are. And so they always overplay their hand. So let's talk about, for a second, the role of sacrifice in ancient societies. The role of sacrifice was meant to discharge the bad blood, the distrust, and the guilt and shame that had been building in a society. Because taboos are broken. Things fall apart. Communities are rattled by envy and resentment. And you have to be able to have a safety valve in ancient societies. This is their thinking, not consciously, but this is the reason why sacrifice was so ubiquitous around the world. So there has to be a way to bottle up those passions rather than let them spill out wherever they want into endless squabbling, fighting, infighting, intrigue, rivalries, and so forth. And so as people imitate each other's bad blood and suspicion and shame, it's like a shame hot potato, throwing it back at the other, throwing it back at the other. And eventually it's going to burn somebody. So society figures out unconsciously, stumbling in the dark, let's all channel that hot potato shame into one vehicle, because that's what our ancestors did. And it worked for them when they had times of crisis or famine or plague or whatever, runaway resentments like we have in our society. So what happens? That sacrifice that coming together and saying, you know what, that person truly did this to us. This person is truly wicked beyond anybody else. That creates unity. It creates a kind of united front of divine justice and wrath. And society's projected that into the skies and said, that's the wrath of gods. The wrath of the gods is upon us, animating the spirit that we're just acting out in this scapegoat lynching in the earlier times, but then it codifies into ritual reenactments of that spontaneous lynch mob in the form of careful sacrificial rituals. And they are to be very careful, because if you are haphazard in the way you repeat these acts of explosive violence, you can create a contaminating violence that envelops the whole community again. So everything, including the chants, the rituals, the way in which you murdered the animal or human, the way in which you told the story about why you were doing this, all those things had to be precariously kept in place at a certain level of decorum and precision, lest you mess up the careful process of controlled violence and create resentments or disbelief in the guilt of the victim, or create a kind of blowback violence in the form of revenge violence, where people say, hey, that guy, I don't think the gods deserved, I don't think the gods want this person to die. I think that's BS, and I'm his friend, and we're going to create a posse to go after you. That would create a civil war. And if you're going to do something that's going to create civil wars all the time, well, then your society is not going to be around. So it's very important for them to get those sacrificial rituals just right. And so that was the way in which they would discharge that bad blood, that built up violence, into a safe, common enemy that everybody believed truly was guilty. That wasn't a cynical plot. Most people truly believed in the guilt of the person they were persecuting, including the people who persecuted Jesus. But the difference with Jesus' story, of course, is that it wasn't mythologized. It wasn't projected into the clouds. The Gospels write it as humans doing the violence, not gods doing it. Those who were going after Jesus believed they were doing it in the name of Yahweh. They were doing it in the name of Yahweh, and then in the name of the people, in the name of keeping the nation together. Caiaphas said it. It is better that one man die than the whole nation perish. And so that was the nation and the God and his purity that they had in mind. But it didn't work, because it didn't create unity. It created schism. They killed Jesus, but they killed God, and they killed an innocent man, and they killed a man who was divinely innocent, and people who were going along in silence and complicity with his lynching, his own disciples, recorded their own guilt, their own mistaken surrender to the crowd, and recorded the innocence of the man that they were killing, and did not, cartoonize the violence, told the truth, that he was innocent, he wasn't deserving of the killing, and that it was just a mob that was built up with envy and resentments and, a sense of righteous indignation that was misplaced. And they showed that Jesus did not have resentment. He didn't say, I'm going to get you back when I get off this cross. You just wait when I come back. No, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. He pronounced an anthropological revelation on the sausage-making process of society and politics itself. And that has been unfolding in 2,000 years, infecting the sensibilities of how we create order and meaning and structure in society. Not in some perfect completion as soon as Jesus starts it. Jesus's death, burial, and resurrection is the first fruits of a kind of resurrection reality that human beings and their free will, voluntary choices are engaged with bringing about in history as they wrap their heads around this crazy upending of everything people thought was sacred, pure, good, holy, and of God. So this inbreaking, this apocalyptic unveiling of the false sacred that has bound humanity together creates a schism in which people are not so bound together, and therefore creativity in terms of identity, in terms of nationhood, in terms of allegiance, in terms of values, in terms of ways in which we're going to conduct ourselves with law and order, all of those things are up for grabs in this creative upending that is subversive and dependent on human beings getting it right. And they get it wrong most of the time, but even when they're getting it wrong, they're still moving the needle forward and getting it partially right. And so we have here in 2023 AD, And America, a country that has got a long tradition in its background, before that with England and other nations in its influence, all saturated by the gospel that upends sacrificial violence. So that comes to these indictments. I have to tell you that this is, people have mentioned this is the end of the republic and the constitutional republic. I can see that. But let me sharpen in on what specifically is going on in terms of what's ending, in my opinion. There's a lot of stuff going on there. But one thing that I think is very specifically at risk of being apocalyptically unveiled and dismantled is our prison industrial complex. America has always been noted for having such a high amount of prisoners per population in our nation, higher than pretty much any nation. And yet, it's always been something that's been like over there. And in fact, the community that has been oftentimes most associated with lock them up and law and order has been conservatives. And yet their biggest folk hero they've had in some time, Donald Trump, has now been the recipient of so many overzealous, unjust, criminal indictments, all nonviolent crimes that they're alleging against him, or process crimes. And they've done this against his entire administration during his term with the Russiagate hoax. They've raided Project Veritas with Ashley Biden now coming out with that tape released by Project Veritas showing that, yes, that was my diary, and it reveals a lot of very suspicious behavior in the part of Joe Biden that confirms a lot of the other things that we've seen about this man. But this is coming at a time where you have journalists like Project Veritas getting raided every time by the FBI, every time, we got to get that diary back. Okay, let's raid all these people, even though they were trying to contact the government to give it back to them anyways. That shows that these institutions that have always maintained this veneer of we are above the fray. We are just methodical, impartial arbiters of justice. That's what they always say, and that's what they always present. Every time they got 20 more criminal indictments for a guy who's beating their incumbent president, who the uniparty likes, Joe Biden is loved in the sense of being a faithful foot soldier for the uniparty establishment. So they don't love him as an individual. They love him because he's a good company man for the neocon, Republican, and Democrat establishment. And then you have Trump, who's a loose cannon, to say the least. He does pretty much what the establishment wants, but has a loose cannon nature to him that challenges the mythic narrative of globalism, of social credit scores, of, globalist trade deals that are managed, crooked, false versions of trade. He pushes the product that they all love so much for this pandemic, but even that he was still pushing generic drugs as something to take a look at too. And that got him a lot of flack, because you're not supposed to do that if you're the official PR spokesperson for the high priestly religion of the DC elite victimism cult. You're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to say whatever big pharma cartel folks have told you to say. That's why you're there, a faithful servant of the uniparty establishment. That's what the role of the presidency is to be the best, most effective PR spokesperson for the interests of the uniparty establishment in the military industrial complex and the pharmaceutical and food industrial complex and all the other ancillary special interests, the law firms, the surveillance state. All that needs a nice, smooth narrative being reinforced to the public with an effective figurehead. And that figurehead needs to be having a connection with the people, which Trump does have a connection with at least close to half of the voting public. But he doesn't faithfully reinforce the mythic narratives of we're doing this war for the victims. We have to go after Russia because they're hurting democracy. All this nonsense that's so stupid. It's so flimsy in its mythic structure. There's not even any believability to it. All you need is to have somebody on stage like Trump just kind of question it slightly and push back on it slightly, and you see how fake the veneer of Democracy Inc. is. After all, Ukraine's arresting dissident journalists and torturing them, shaking people down for money, selling weapons that we're giving to them, sending soldiers to die while the people in the elite areas of Kiev are partying like it's Vegas. I mean, this is their bastion of democracy, Nancy Pelosi, and everybody wants you to know. But if you just look at it, media technology shows you the other side for those who would have even an inkling of a desire to stay out of the obvious propaganda machine of the dying corporate press and their social media ghettos. So Trump, for all of his mistakes and perpetuations of some of the older myths of the American government and the American societal framework, is still considered a brazen heretic for the new regime of victimism in its hyper form that it's presenting today, trying to normalize things they're doing to kids and so forth. The normalization of, the hatred of meat and everything at such a shrill level, it's insane. But in indicting him like this, what they're doing is they're going to take away the hardcore fan, because conservatives have had some types of conservatives and libertarians and religious conservatives have had some criminal justice reform desire for some time. But there's a hardcore base of populist type conservatives who are most open to the idea of tough on crime, law and order stuff. And yet now with January 6th, watching again, BLM protesters and Antifa protesters get completely protected by the media and the justice system. And pop culture completely 100% protected them, even though they were guilty of a lot of heinous violence and crimes and murder. And then watching these people who felt legitimate grievances, they showed up with no guns or something, but they're supposed to be trying to do, this manufactured, made for TV insurrection thing. It's so stupid. People watch it, they know there's just something not right about this on so many levels. And then they see all these people getting these long, onerous sentences. And the people who are the tough on crime people are the people most sympathetic to these people. So now for the first time, they're starting to see a visceral example of that. The justice system is corrupt. And the way they're using these conspiracy laws to go after Trump and everybody he ever met and wrap people up and all these different, nonviolent process crimes for this or that. People who are most akin to say, no, we just need tough on crime. If you did the crime, you do the time. Those type of people have now been saturated with how bogus and how corrupt so much of the justice system is. And it has been for decades and decades and decades to various different groups, to various different targets of the scapegoating mechanism of DC. And so this is the end of the teeth of the mythic narrative of DC. Because once you've put the president himself in the crosshairs of being in prison for these nonviolent crimes and these process crimes and these things that are obviously cooked up for political purposes, the selective persecution of Trump for something his guy did on a tax thing or something he did with a payment thing. And meanwhile, the people that were hanging out with Epstein 27 times, there's no indictments, no investigations. People who are even the dumbest, most foolish, lemmings for whatever the TV tells them. They viscerally feel that the mythic catharsis that they're supposed to experience by going along with this hoodwinked suspension of disbelief that they always get just doesn't feel as good. And when it doesn't feel as satisfying because the facts of reality are catching up to such a degree that even with their sheer hatred of Trump, they still feel a little bit of visceral, it is a little weird. That Biden guy is so corrupt. And yet nothing happens to him and his family. The Clintons are so corrupt. Nothing happens. All these things go on and on and on. Project Veritas has a diary of the guys that are protected in the protected class, and they get raided and all this stuff. They're trying to override free speech with this disinfo, psyop stuff. And there's a lot of folks on the left that have that latent suspicion of establishment still in them. Look at Robert Kennedy Jr.'s success. Despite, the different things that he has stacked against him, he's got significant, support in the primary voter base of the Democrats, not to mention the crossover appeal that independents would have for a lot of the things he's saying. And he's questioning the war narrative, which the Democrats were the saturated dogmatic base for that war narrative against Russia being baked. And yet there's a lot of appeal with all of that propaganda pumped onto those people for decades now, that there's a large contingent of that voter base that's like, no, I still want to see through the lies of this war machine, including the ones against Russia. And he's questioned the big pharma and the pandemic nonsense. And again, the Democrat base was the hardcore, that was the fundamentalist base for that whole narrative for the pandemic. And yet he's getting significant support. He questions criminal justice reform. The criminal justice system, the military industrial complex, the surveillance state. These are very deep libertarian type instincts that are still alive and well, even with all of the demonization of reality that the Democrat base has been going along with. And so now when they actually viscerally, if they go, I'm telling you, the most effective thing the establishment could do to sow their delegitimization permanently would be to put Donald Trump behind bars. If he skirts justice in terms of the Democrats' perspective, if he gets away, if he beats all those criminal charges, he will have less power than if he goes to prison. That's the paradox, but you can only understand that paradox in light of what I have been saying and showing as the biblical text is. That the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. When you expel someone as a scapegoat in light of the cross, 2,000 years saturating your culture, it will create backfiring effects. It will create people starting to say, I hated Trump, but there's something weird about how he's getting hit with 100 criminal indictments. And he was the first guy to say no to the war, no new wars. The first guy that did criminal justice reform, by the way. So the DOJ maybe have some grievance about that too. First guy that wasn't on script about big pharma being the only thing you can take when you have a disease. We're mentioning generics, that big pharma their whole business model is united against promoting generics as anything to consider, really. First person to kind of question globalism and the whole, project of globalism and that kind of thing. So here we have, and that's the one that gets all these criminal indictments. And yet everybody else on the Republican and Democrat side, who we all know they're corrupt. Even the dumbest person who has bought into Kool-Aid knows viscerally subconscious. They're living under a severe amount of cognitive dissonance. They know that the Clintons are corrupt. They know that these folks are corrupt. They know that the Democrat Senate leaders are corrupt, just like the Republicans are. And we all know that. And then when you see one person getting all this fire towards him, it breaks the legitimacy of the justice system and this kind of above the fray aura of grinding your opponents into prison, industrial complex, gulags in America. It just delegitimizes it even more. It makes it less legitimate than ever before, because you already have a huge base on the Democrat and independent side and libertarians who are questioning the drug war, questioning locking people up in perpetuity for every nonviolent victimless crime. And you've had that growing on a softer way in the conservative Republican camp with criminal justice reform, revisiting nonviolent crimes on that level. And then now you have the populist base, which was the most open to tough on crime sentencing, viscerally seeing their folk hero, Trump, and January 6th and Project Veritas and all these folks getting everything slammed at them. They're now saying, how can I ever look at this system the same way again? They're now getting a crash course education on how illegitimate the use of conspiracy laws and all these other little laws that lump everybody together. If you knew your cousin and your cousin knew a friend who dropped off a package for drugs and you happen to say hello to them at McDonald's or something, that gets you all the drugs that were ever shipped by that guy's friends and all the other friends. I mean, the kind of stupidity they get away with for everyday people. Now Trump is going to vicariously experience, or he's going to go through something that people who have been on the wrong side of this corrupt justice system that feeds off of nonviolent behavior and process crimes and threats to get plea deals. All of them are going to viscerally have a kind of common ground with a guy that they may have ostensibly on the left not really given a second thought. And those on the right who have never really really looked at criminal justice system as something corrupt deeply and needing to really reform the laws and the practices therein are finally going to start to look and are starting to look at how corrupt the whole system is. And with that comes the legitimacy of all the agencies that are built on the threat of sacrificial violence. For example, the FDA. The FDA gets to say the king tells you that this is a drug and that is not. And if you push something into the conscience of the public that is not a king's approved pharmaceutical toxin with hundreds of billions of dollars behind it to get the FDA approval, then you will go to prison. That undermines their legitimacy even more now that people are starting to see across the board uniformly how political, petty, lying, the whole legitimacy of these institutions really is. You can't unsee it. You can't unsee it. And just like the wars are losing their legitimacy more and more now because they're exposed to media, and social media allows you to see alternative stories and crimes of against humanity that our angels are that we're supposed to be backing may have actually committed. So it's not just a black and white morality play like the idiotic TV wants you to make you believe. That delegitimizes the war machine, and now that's a form of sacrificial that's a sacrificial outlet, the war machine, right? We're all united because we've got a common enemy to fight overseas. That's been a good grift for scoundrels on the war machine for decades. But now it's losing its believability on left and right and independence because people see the alternative stories. Then you look at the justice system. That's the other domestic form of sacrificial violence, right? We are all together as Americans because we have above the fray justice system that, yeah, every now and then we say, yeah, it's corrupt, but we politicize that question. But now everybody in all the different political corners have a grievance and an awareness of how corrupt the justice system is. And it loses its bite. It loses its teeth when you put the president into a prison cage. Because again, even though they've tried to make him out to be a heretic as an illegitimate president, if they put Donald Trump in prison, that is still a person who sat in the priestly, role of the chief PR representative for the establishment. That is a very sacred role according to DC narrative myth making. And try as they have to try to delegitimize him as an interloper, it's still, he has that aura of I was a president. And if you put a president, the high priest figure of the DC religion, into the belly of the prison system, which is the place of Golgotha, so to speak, that's the place of expelling, that's the place of shame, that's the place of the scapegoat of the person who is filthy. That will viscerally rot the religion of the DC elites deeper than they could possibly imagine. But they don't seem to have that capacity of awareness of cultural analysis. They're not educated, apparently, about anthropology, at least to this level. To understand what they're doing will have deep, profound consequences for undermining their money-making grift. Because it's not just that the justice system is a money-making grift for the petty little nonviolent crimes that everyday people get arrested for. That will be soured and continue to be soured by this. But it's also, again, the way in which those different agencies have regulatory criminal statutes that protect the little fiefdoms of things like FDA and things like EPA and all these other things that end up, being able to grind up people into regulatory, criminal charges, which then sacrificially provide catharsis and unity and strength and power for that agency and its industry oligarchs that it serves. And so all of those things are going to be continually eroded. The legitimacy of these agencies that do normal regulations, not just the FBI and those other things that Fox News or Newsmax crowd are constantly talking about being corrupt. but it's going to sour the ordinary vanilla agencies too that are constantly doing this to people without as much fanfare. When you take someone who is the most famous person perhaps in the world, Trump, and a presidential figure who did do things like criminal justice reform, didn't start a war, different basic things like that, that the public has to realize. And remember, the public has, rehabilitated even George W. Bush from the monster he used to be. They don't accept his wars and stuff like that, but the Democrat machine has rehabilitated his image. But I think that, they say it takes history a little time to judge and reassess. I think that the more the public sees some of the things that Trump was trying to accomplish, besides the rhetoric that they get all mimetically bound up in, that because it threatens their ego when he talks with his little ego gimmick, they'll realize that dude was not doing that much of a heinous job. He was doing a little bit of criminal justice reform, did some pardons that the other presidents wouldn't do, threw a few sacred cows out in terms of rhetoric about war and globalism, things like that. He kind of pushed that, and that was overall a positive thing as compared to other presidents who are going off the wars and doing the kind of heinous stuff that we see happening every day in the headlines. And I think that that's going to continually unite the public in a delegitimizing sentiment towards the sacred aura of DC's alphabet agencies, including the vanilla regulatory agencies like those that manage food and drug, which, again, dictate the health terms of millions of people, and in my opinion, in a catastrophic way. So as those institutions get delegitimized, it opens up more and more opportunity for creative reassessment and reapproaching things from a fresh perspective outside of the mimetic aura of these supposedly untouchable, above the fray institutions. And remember, that's why with this special counsel guy, Jack Smith, those folks are always talking about, this is about saying that no one is above the law, but that's their attempt to try to keep the myth going. We're just doing this because it just randomly happened that this guy was doing criminal charges, and all we're doing is just going through with doing our job. It's not about politics. And we know that's a lie. Everyone knows that's a lie. Everyone knows it's a lie. And that lie is going to continually erode the foundations of legitimacy for all of their perpetual bullying that they do with regulations to push you into this light bulb or push you into this food or toxic seed oils, or not using a generic drug that's non-toxic, but using some stupid new experimental product they're going to push next. All that stuff's going to continually be eroded because people don't trust these people anymore. And if you don't have trust, you don't have any believability in the myths. And if you don't have any believability in the myths, you have no justification to do your sacrificial violence anymore. And therefore, the prison industrial complex is on notice that it will continue to disintegrate. And without the teeth backing up its bullying, what does the state really have? Without the teeth of sacrificial threats of coercion, what does it really have? And because America has an outsized influence all over the world in the West, it's going to continually undermine those institutions as well as it continues to sow its own distrust into the public. So the best thing that people who are in anti-establishment perspectives could do is to not try to double down. Well, we got to take authoritarian measures to beat them. Unfortunately, I know that seems like the intuitive thing to do, but when you're following God, when you're following Jesus, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. And learning how to flow with that social aikido will allow your opponents to be defeated by their own overreach faster than you getting in the way and saying, oh, you want to be an authoritarian? Well, I'll get you one day. I'll be an authoritarian back one day when I get my chance at power. And the public in the middle, who's kind of can go either way, they'll just stick with the devil they know. They'll stick with the establishment person who has authoritarian behavior that they've been used to, not this new right wing or whatever ripoff wannabe Little Caesar stuff comes up to try to challenge it. So the best thing that people could do is to not mimic that posture of authoritarianism and lawlessness, but rather to educate people on what money is, on what economics is, on what the personhood revolution of Jesus is. What does it mean to imitate Jesus? What does it mean to live that out in your daily life, and the character that you exude and the people that you impact? and then to build society, stay out of debt, build innovation, make signs and wonders, help people heal from these catastrophic diseases that our government has subsidized into the world, and to build up a society that can replace with this flimsy lie, myth, violence-based top-down system, something that's decentralized, something that's nonviolent, something that is inspiring, that creates wonder in the hearts of people to want to get up every day and work hard to do great things. I'm David Gornoski. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. You can email me hello@neighborschoice.com. Godspeed.